The power cut at 2:47 hours. The field hospital went dark. Generators kicked in 3 seconds later, but the lights in the east corridor stayed black. Doctor. Amara froze mid-suture, her hands slick with blood from the soldier on the table. Then came the gunfire, not distant, not outside the perimeter. Inside, the security detail was already dead. In the corner of the surgical tent, Claire Dawson, night shift nurse, quiet, forgettable, set down her tray. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She reached under the supply cabinet and pulled out something that wasn't in the inventory. Her hands didn't shake. Forward operating base Sentinel sat 12 kilometers from the Syrian border. A collection of prefabricated structures and reinforced tents, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. It wasn't a combat outpost, not officially. It was a humanitarian medical facility, operated by a coalition of international aid organizations and staffed by contract personnel from a dozen countries. But everyone who worked there knew the truth. The wounded who arrived on stretchers weren't civilians, they were soldiers. And the distant gunfire that echoed across the valley every night wasn't training exercises. The field hospital ran on shifts. Day shift handled the surgical load. Night shift kept people alive until morning. Claire Dawson worked nights. She'd been there for 6 weeks. She was listed as a registered nurse with trauma experience, contracted through a medical staffing agency based in Geneva. Her paperwork was clean. Her references were solid. Her performance was unremarkable in the best possible way. She showed up on time, followed protocols, didn't complain, and blended into the background so completely that most of the day's staff didn't know her name. That was exactly how she wanted it. The hospital's main structure was a hardened tent reinforced with steel, framing, and ballistic fabric. Inside, it was divided into sections: triage, surgery, post-op, intensive care. The night shift was small. 2 doctors, 4 nurses, 3 orderlies, and a physician assistant who rotated between the wards. They handled overflow from the day's surgeries, monitored critical patients, and stabilized anyone who came in after dark. Claire worked the intensive care section, 6 beds. All of them occupied. At 2100 hours, she made her rounds. She checked IV lines, adjusted ventilator settings, and documented vitals on a battered tablet that had been dropped so many times, the screen was spiderwebbed with cracks. She moved quietly, efficiently, her hands steady and her face unreadable. When a patient's blood pressure dropped, she corrected it before the monitor alarm even sounded. When an oxygen saturation dipped, she adjusted the flow rate and repositioned the cannula without waking the patient. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer opinions, but she watched everything. She knew that the base's security detail had been cut from 18 to 11 over the past 2 weeks. She knew that the perimeter cameras on the east side had been malfunctioning for 4 days, and no one had fixed them. She knew that the guard rotations were predictable, same routes, same timing, same blind spots. And she knew that for the past 3 nights something had been testing the fence line. It was subtle. A cut wire here, a motion sensor tripped there, the kind of thing that could be explained away as animals or wind. But Claire had seen it before. She knew what probing looked like. She knew what came next. She just didn't know when. At 22:30, Dr. Amara Okafor walked into the ICU section, pulling off her surgical gloves. She was a Nigerian trauma surgeon in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and perpetually exhausted. She'd been at Sentinel for 8 months. She was one of the few people who'd bothered to learn Claire's name. "Quiet night?" Amara asked, tossing the gloves into the biohazard bin. "So far," Claire said. Amara glanced at the monitors. "How's bed 3? Stable. Respiratory rates improved. I reduced the sedation an hour ago." Amara nodded. "Good call." She leaned against the supply cart, rubbing her eyes. "We had 2 come in this evening, shrapnel wounds. One of them didn't make it." Claire didn't respond. There was nothing to say. People died here. That was the job. Amara studied her for a moment. "You're very calm." He worked trauma before. "Where?" Claire didn't look up from the tablet. "Different places." It wasn't rude, it wasn't evasive, it was just nothing. A response that gave no information and invited no follow-up. Amara had tried a few times over the past weeks to get to know her. She'd learned nothing. Claire Dawson was polite, competent, and completely opaque. Amara sighed. "Well, if it stays quiet, maybe you'll actually get a meal break tonight, maybe." Claire said. Amara left. Claire continued her rounds. At midnight, she stepped outside for air. The base was dark except for the floodlights mounted on the perimeter towers. The temperature had dropped. The wind carried dust, and the faint smell of burning fuel from the generator depot. Claire stood near the rear entrance of the hospital tent, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fence. She didn't have night vision goggles. She didn't need them. She'd spent enough time in places like this to know how to read the shadows. She watched the guard walking his patrol along the east fence line. She watched the way he checked his phone twice in 3 minutes. She watched the way he turned his back to the desert for 20 seconds while he lit a cigarette. Sloppy, Claire turned and went back inside. At 100. The physician assistant, a young American named Garrett, came into the ICU section looking frazzled. "We've got an inbound," he said. "ETA 10 minutes. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. They're saying he's unstable." Claire nodded. "I'll prep a bay." She moved quickly, pulling supplies from the storage lockers. She laid out intubation equipment, IV kits, trauma shears, and surgical drapes. She checked the suction. She prepped the crash cart. By the time the patient arrived on a stretcher carried by 2 soldiers, everything was ready. The man was unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood. Garrett and one of the other nurses began cutting away the clothing. Claire started a second IV line, her hands moving with practiced precision. She didn't flinch at the blood. She didn't hesitate. She'd done this hundreds of times. Dr. Amara appeared, still in her surgical scrubs from earlier. She assessed the wound, called for imaging, and began barking orders. Claire followed them without question. She handed off supplies. She documented vitals. She stayed 2 steps ahead of what was needed. 30 minutes later, the patient was stable enough to move to surgery. Garrett and the orderlies wheeled him out. Claire stayed behind to clean the bay. She wiped down the surfaces, restocked the supplies, and disposed of the blood-soaked linens. When she was finished, she washed her hands and checked the time. She made another round of the ICU. All 6 patients were stable. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm. The ventilators hissed softly. Everything was under control, but Claire didn't relax. She moved to the window and looked out into the darkness. The east fence line was barely visible in the distance. The guard was gone, probably rotating to another section. The floodlights cast long, uneven shadows across the dirt. And somewhere out there, beyond the wire, someone was watching. Claire could feel it. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know how many. But she knew they were coming. She turned away from the window and walked back to the supply room. She opened a cabinet and counted the trauma kits. She checked the oxygen canisters. She made a mental note of the fire extinguisher mounted near the door. Then she did something no one would have noticed. She moved a stack of linens on the top shelf. Behind them, hidden in the shadows, was a ventilation grate. Claire reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the corner of the grate. It shifted slightly. Still there, she replaced the linens and closed the cabinet. At 2:30, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the break room. It was cold and bitter. She drank it anyway. At 2:45, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but silence and the faint hum of machinery winding down. Then the emergency generators kicked in with a mechanical growl, and the lights flickered back on dim, orange emergency mode. Half the hospital was still dark. The east corridor, the storage wings. The administrative offices. Claire set down her coffee cup. She didn't move toward the light like everyone else did. She moved toward the window. From somewhere outside, she heard shouting, not panicked. Tactical clipped commands in a language she recognized but didn't speak. Then came the gunfire, short, controlled bursts. AK-pattern rifles, close. Too close, the security detail was engaging. And then, suddenly, they weren't. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. It was the kind of silence that meant something final had happened. Claire's jaw tightened. She turned away from the window and walked quickly toward the ICU section. Dr. Amara was already there, her hands still gloved from surgery. She looked up when Claire entered, her eyes wide. "What's happening? We're under attack," Claire said calmly. "What? How do you?" The lights in the main corridor went out completely. A moment later, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the east entrance. Then footsteps, heavy, multiple, running, and then the screaming started. Amara froze. One of the orderlies, a young Kenyan man named David, stumbled into the ICU from the hallway, his face pale. "They're inside," he said, his voice shaking. "They're inside the building." They shot the guards at the door. "There how many?" Claire's voice cut through his panic like a blade. David blinked at her. "I don't know, I saw 3, maybe 4, they have rifles." "They're going room to room," Claire turned to Amara. "Get everyone in the ICU into the storage room. Now what? We can't move the patients, not the patients, the staff, anyone who can walk. Get them into the storage room and lock the door." Amara stared at her. "Where are you going?" "To buy you time." Claire didn't wait for a response. She moved past David and into the hallway. The emergency lights cast everything in deep orange shadow. She could hear voices now, harsh, commanding, speaking in Arabic. She could hear doors being kicked open. She could hear a woman crying. She moved quickly but didn't run. Running made noise. Running drew attention. She passed the triage section. Empty. She passed the surgical prep area. Dark. Then she saw him. One of the insurgents was standing in the middle of the corridor, his rifle raised, scanning the rooms. He was young, maybe 25, wearing a mismatched uniform and a chest rig loaded with magazines. His finger was on the trigger. His eyes were wide. Adrenaline, fear. Aggression. Claire stepped back into the shadows before he turned. She pressed herself against the wall and controlled her breathing. Slow, steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She'd done this before, in Fallujah, in Mosul, in places that didn't have names. The insurgent moved past her, his boots heavy on the tile floor. He didn't look left, didn't check the corners. Sloppy, Claire waited until he was 10 feet past her. Then she moved. She didn't have a weapon, not yet. But she didn't need one. She closed the distance in 4 silent steps. Her left hand came up and clamped over his mouth. Her right arm hooked around his neck and applied pressure to the carotid artery. He tried to struggle. He tried to bring the rifle around. But Claire had leverage and training and 20 pounds of body weight driving him backward into the wall. It took 11 seconds. When he went limp, she lowered him to the floor and took his rifle. She checked the chamber, loaded. She pulled 2 magazines from his chest rig and clipped them to her waistband. Then she dragged his body into an empty patient room and closed the door. She checked the hallway. Clear. She moved toward the storage room where she'd told Amara to hide. The door was closed. She knocked twice, paused, then knocked once. A signal. The door cracked open. Amara's face appeared, pale and frightened. Behind her, Claire could see David, another nurse named Fatima, and Garrett, the physician assistant. 4 people. Unarmed, terrified, stay inside, Claire said quietly. Don't open this door unless you hear my voice. If anyone else tries to get in. Push the supply shelves against the door and stay silent. What are you doing? Amara whispered. My job. Claire closed the door and heard the lock click. She turned and moved back into the corridor. Gunfire had stopped. That wasn't a good sign. It meant the insurgents had secured the area. It meant they were transitioning from assault to control. It meant they'd start moving through the wards systematically. And it meant they'd start executing the wounded. Claire moved toward the post-op section. She kept the rifle low, finger off the trigger, muzzle down. She didn't want to fire unless she had to. Gunfire would give away her position. It would tell them she was here. And right now, her greatest advantage was that they didn't know she existed. She reached the post-op ward and stopped. 2 insurgents were inside. One was standing at the foot of a bed, pointing his rifle at a patient. The other was rifling through a medical cabinet, looking for drugs or supplies. The patient, a young soldier with bandages wrapped around his chest, was awake, his eyes wide with terror. Claire assessed the angles. 10 meters, 2 targets. One had his back to her. The other was partially obscured by the bed frame. She couldn't take them both without firing. And if she fired, the others would hear. She had 3 seconds to decide. Claire made her choice. She stepped into the doorway, raised the rifle, and fired twice. The first shot hit the insurgent at the cabinet in the back of the head. He dropped without a sound. The second shot hit the man at the bedside in the neck. He staggered, tried to bring his rifle up, and collapsed. The patient in the bed didn't scream. He just stared at Claire, his mouth open, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Claire lowered the rifle and put one finger to her lips. The patient nodded. She moved to the bodies and checked them. Both dead. She took another magazine from one of the chest rigs and a radio clipped to the second man's belt. She turned the volume down to barely audible and clipped it to her waistband. Then she heard voices on the radio. Arabic, fast. Urgent, she didn't need a translator to know what they were saying. They'd heard the shots. Claire moved. She left the post-op ward and headed for the stairwell at the north end of the building. The hospital was single-story, but there was an upper storage loft used for equipment and overflow supplies. It wasn't marked on the visitor maps. Most of the staff didn't even know it existed, but Claire did. She climbed the stairs in the dark, her boots silent on the metal steps. The loft was narrow, hot, and filled with stacked crates and unused gurneys. There was a small window at the far end that overlooked the main courtyard. Claire moved to the window and looked out. 3 more insurgents were crossing the courtyard toward the main entrance. They were moving in a loose formation, weapons up, eyes scanning. One of them was speaking into a radio. Claire set the rifle down and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small multi-tool and knelt beside one of the crates. She pried open the side panel, reached inside, and pulled out a piece of oilcloth wrapped around something long and metallic. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a disassembled rifle. Not the AK she'd taken from the insurgent. This was a Remington 700, bolt action, suppressed. With a scope she'd zeroed herself 2 weeks ago in the dead of night while everyone else was asleep. She'd hidden it here the day after she arrived, just in case. Claire assembled the rifle in 40 seconds. She checked the chamber, loaded. She adjusted the scope and moved back to the window. The 3 insurgents were at the entrance now. One of them was trying the door. Another was speaking into his radio. The third was scanning the rooftops. Claire steadied her breathing. She braced the rifle against the window frame. She calculated windage, distance. Drop, then she exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The suppressor muffled the shot to a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. The insurgent at the door dropped instantly. The other 2 froze. They didn't know where the shot had come from. They spun, searching, their rifles swinging wildly. Claire cycled the bolt. Aimed, fired. The second man went down, the third broke and ran. He made it 6 steps before Claire's third shot dropped him in the middle of the courtyard. She pulled back from the window and listened. The radio on her belt crackled. Voices, confused, angry. They were regrouping. Claire checked her ammunition. 4 rounds left in the Remington. 2 magazines for the AK, not enough. She disassembled the Remington and wrapped it back in the oilcloth. Then she slung the AK over her shoulder and moved back toward the stairs. She had maybe 5 minutes before they realized what was happening. 5 minutes before they understood they weren't hunting staff anymore, they were being hunted. Claire descended the stairs in silence. Her movements deliberate and controlled. The AK was slung across her back now, the Remington wrapped and tucked under her left arm. She moved through the darkened corridor like a shadow, her eyes adjusting to the low light, her ears tracking every sound. The radio on her belt crackled again. The voices were louder now, more frantic. She caught fragments, numbers, directions, commands. They were coordinating, regrouping. They'd lost 6 men in less than 10 minutes, and they didn't understand how. That confusion was her advantage. But it wouldn't last. Claire reached the ground floor and paused at the junction between the main corridor and the east wing. She needed to know how many were left. She needed to know their positions. And she needed to do it without being seen. She moved to a supply closet near the triage section and slipped inside. The space was cramped, lined with shelves of linens and medical supplies. She set the wrapped Remington on the floor and pulled the radio from her belt. She turned the volume up slightly and listened. The chatter was continuous now. She counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. They were searching the building room by room, and they were getting more aggressive. One of them mentioned the storage room. Another said something about hostages. Claire's jaw tightened. They were going to find Amara and the others. She clipped the radio back to her belt, grabbed the Remington, and moved. She crossed the corridor and entered the east wing through a side door marked authorized personnel only. The hallway beyond was dark. The emergency lights either damaged or deliberately disabled. She moved by feel and memory, her fingers brushing the wall to guide her. At the end of the hall was a maintenance access ladder that led to the upper loft, a secondary route she'd mapped the first week she'd arrived. She climbed quickly, her hands gripping the rungs, her boots making no sound. The loft was hotter than before. The air smelled like dust and old paint. Claire moved to the far end, where a narrow catwalk overlooked the main ward below. She knelt, unwrapped the Remington, and assembled it again. Then she looked down. The main ward was lit by emergency lights, dim, orange, casting long shadows across the rows of beds. Most of the patients were still in place, too injured or sedated to move. And moving between them were two insurgents. They were checking each bed, looking for something. Or someone. Claire raised the rifle and looked through the scope. She tracked the first man as he moved down the row. He was older than the others she'd seen, maybe 40, with a graying beard and a scar across his left cheek. He carried himself differently, more confident. More experienced, he was the leader. Claire shifted her aim to the second man. Younger, nervous. He kept glancing toward the door, his rifle held too high, his finger on the trigger. She calculated the shot. 15 meters, slight downward angle, no wind. The suppressor would muffle the sound but not eliminate it. If she fired, the leader would know. He'd take cover. And she'd lose the angle. She needed them both in the open. Claire waited. The younger insurgent moved toward a bed near the center of the room. An older man was lying there, his leg in a cast, his eyes closed. The insurgent nudged him with the barrel of his rifle. The patient groaned and opened his eyes. The insurgent leaned in close, speaking in Arabic. The patient shook his head, confused, terrified. The insurgent raised his rifle. Claire fired. The shot hit him in the temple. He collapsed across the bed, his rifle clattering to the floor. The leader spun, his weapon coming up, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't look up, not yet. He moved toward the nearest doorway, his back to the wall, his movements controlled. Smart. Claire cycled the bolt and adjusted her aim. He was moving toward cover. In 3 seconds, he'd be behind a concrete pillar and she'd lose the shot. She exhaled and fired. The round hit him in the upper chest. He staggered, dropped to one knee, and tried to bring his rifle around. Claire fired again. This time, he didn't get back up. She pulled back from the edge of the catwalk and listened. Silence, then from somewhere below, she heard running footsteps. The radio crackled, shouting. They knew now. They knew someone was picking them off. And they were coming. Claire disassembled the Remington, wrapped it, and slung it across her back. She pulled the AK around and checked the magazine. 22 rounds left. She had one more magazine. 30 rounds total, not enough for a firefight. She needed to move. She climbed back down the maintenance ladder and emerged into the east wing corridor. The footsteps were closer now, heavy, fast, moving in her direction. She turned left and moved toward the rear exit. Halfway down the hall, she stopped. A door to her right was partially open. Inside was a small examination room, unused, the furniture covered in dust. Claire stepped inside and closed the door most of the way, leaving it open just a crack. She crouched behind a metal cabinet and waited. 10 seconds later, 2 insurgents burst into the hallway. They were moving fast, scanning left and right, their rifles raised. One of them shouted something. The other responded. They were arguing. Panicking, they passed the examination room without looking inside. Claire waited until they were 6 feet past the door. Then she stepped out behind them. Hey, they both turned. Claire fired twice. Center mass. Both men dropped. She moved forward, checked them, and took their ammunition, 4 magazines. She clipped 2 to her waistband and left the other 2. Too much weight, the radio crackled again. This time the voice was different, calmer. Giving orders, reinforcements were coming. Claire swore under her breath. She moved quickly back toward the main hospital section. She needed to get to the storage room. She needed to get Amara and the others out before the next wave arrived. She reached the corridor outside the storage room and knocked. 2 quick, 1 slow. The door opened immediately. Amara's face appeared pale and streaked with tears. Thank God, she whispered. We heard shooting. We thought, how many entrances does this room have? Claire interrupted. Just this one. Why? Because they're coming, and when they get here this door won't hold. Garrett pushed forward from behind Amara. What do you mean they're coming? How many are there? I've counted 8 so far. I've dropped 6. That leaves 2, plus however many are outside the perimeter. Garrett stared at her. You killed 6 people? Claire didn't answer. She looked past him into the storage room. 4 people, unarmed, afraid she couldn't protect them and fight at the same time. She needed them somewhere safer. There's a basement level, Claire said, under the surgical wing. It's used for cold storage and mechanical systems. There's a reinforced door and no windows. If you can get there, you can lock yourselves in. Amara shook her head. I don't know where that is. I do, Claire said. Follow me, stay low, stay quiet, don't stop moving. She didn't wait for agreement. She turned and moved down the corridor. Behind her she heard footsteps. Amara, David, Fatima, Garrett, all of them following. Claire led them through the darkened hallways, moving quickly but carefully. She checked every corner. Every doorway, every shadow. They reached the surgical wing without incident. At the far end was a heavy metal door marked mechanical access. Claire pulled it open and gestured them inside. A staircase descended into darkness. Go, she said. There's a door at the bottom. Lock it behind you. Don't open it for anyone unless they give you this knock. Too quick, one slow, then too quick again. Understand? Amara hesitated. What about you? I'm going to make sure they don't follow you. Claire, go. Now, Amara looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and started down the stairs. The others followed. Claire waited until she heard the door at the bottom close and lock. Then she turned and walked back into the surgical wing. She moved to the center of the room and looked around. Surgical tables, instrument trays, oxygen canisters, IV poles. She had an idea. Claire worked quickly. She disconnected an oxygen line from the wall mount and opened the valve slightly. The gas hissed softly into the air. She moved to the second oxygen port and did the same. Then she pulled a surgical drape from a cabinet and draped it over one of the tables. Letting the fabric hang low, she took a position behind a concrete pillar near the door and waited. 2 minutes later, she heard them coming, footsteps. Voices, the two remaining insurgents moving cautiously now, checking rooms as they went. They reached the surgical wing. One of them pushed the door open slowly, his rifle raised. He stepped inside. The second man followed. They scanned the room, empty, dark, silent. One of them said something in Arabic, the other responded. They moved deeper into the room, toward the surgical tables. Claire pulled a flare from her pocket, taken from an emergency kit 2 weeks ago and hidden in her jacket. She struck it against the floor. The flare ignited with a sharp hiss and a burst of red light. She threw it into the center of the room. The oxygen ignited instantly. The explosion wasn't massive. It wasn't meant to be. But it was enough. The fireball engulfed the surgical tables and rolled across the ceiling. The two insurgents were thrown backward, their clothes and gear catching fire. Claire stepped out from behind the pillar. She raised the AK and fired twice. Both men stopped moving. The flames spread quickly, feeding on the oxygen and the fabric drapes. Claire turned and ran. She exited the surgical wing, closed the door behind her, and moved toward the rear of the building. Smoke was already seeping under the door. The fire alarms, what was left of them, began to wail. Claire reached the rear exit and pushed it open. The night air was cold and sharp. She stepped outside and looked toward the perimeter. In the distance, she could see headlights. Vehicles, moving fast. The reinforcements had arrived. Claire turned and looked back at the hospital. Smoke was pouring from the east wing now. Flames were visible through the windows. She had maybe 10 minutes before the fire spread to the basement level. 10 minutes to get Amara and the others out. 10 minutes to finish this. Claire checked her ammunition. 1 magazine left. 30 rounds. She slung the rifle across her back, pulled the radio from her belt and listened. The voices were frantic now, screaming, orders. Panic, she turned the volume down and clipped it back to her belt. Then she ran. The headlights were closer now. Claire moved along the outer wall of the hospital, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The fire inside was spreading. She could hear the roar of it, see the orange glow flickering through the windows. The smoke was thick, pouring out of the vents and broken glass. It would draw attention. It would bring people running. That was the problem. She reached the corner of the building and stopped. From here, she could see the main gate. 3 vehicles, technical trucks, mounted with heavy machine guns, were parked just inside the perimeter. Men were dismounting, at least a dozen of them, armed and moving with purpose. They weren't panicking. They were organized. This wasn't a raid. It was an assault team, and now they knew the hospital was compromised. Claire pulled back and moved toward the south wing. It was the oldest section of the facility, a converted storage building with concrete walls and narrow windows. It connected to the basement level through a service corridor. If she could reach it before they locked down the building, she could get Amara and the others out through the rear access tunnel. But she had to go through them first. She entered the south wing through a side door, moving quickly through the darkened hallway. The air was cooler here, the smoke hadn't reached this section yet. She passed empty offices and supply closets, her boots silent on the concrete floor. At the end of the hall was a stairwell. She descended 2 flights and emerged into the basement corridor. The walls were bare concrete, the ceiling lined with pipes and electrical conduit. The only light came from a single emergency bulb at the far end, casting everything in dim red. Claire moved to the mechanical room door and knocked, 2 quick, 1 slow. 2 quick, the door opened immediately. Amara's face appeared pale and exhausted. "Thank God," she breathed. "We heard the explosion, we thought we need to move," Claire interrupted. "Now." "There's a service tunnel at the end of this corridor. It leads to an equipment shed outside the perimeter. We go through there, we can reach the vehicle depot," Garrett pushed forward. "What about the patients upstairs? They're safer where they are," Claire said. "The fire's contained to the east wing. The main wards are concrete and steel. As long as the fire doesn't spread, they'll survive, and if it does spread," Claire met his eyes. "Then we get help, but we can't help anyone if we're dead." Amara touched Garrett's arm. "She's right. We have to go." Claire stepped back and let them file out. Amara, David, Fatima, Garrett, 4 people, unarmed, exhausted. Traumatized, she couldn't take them into a firefight. "Follow the tunnel to the end," Claire said. "There's a ladder that leads up to the shed. Wait there. Don't come out until you hear vehicles." "Coalition vehicles, understand?" Amara stared at her. "Where are you going to make sure they don't follow you?" "Claire, go now." Amara hesitated, then nodded. She turned and led the others down the corridor toward the tunnel entrance. Claire watched them disappear into the darkness. Then she turned and moved back toward the stairwell. She climbed to the ground floor and emerged into the south wing hallway. She could hear voices now, shouting, boots on concrete, the clatter of weapons. They were inside. They were sweeping the building. Claire moved quickly to a supply closet and pulled the door open. Inside were shelves of cleaning supplies, maintenance tools, and equipment. She grabbed 2 bottles of industrial cleaner, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. Then she moved to the next room, a small office with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a window overlooking the courtyard. She worked fast. She emptied the bottles of cleaner into a metal wastebasket and added a torn section of cloth soaked in alcohol from a medical kit. She taped the setup beneath the desk, then ran a tripwire across the doorway using surgical tubing from her pocket. The wire was nearly invisible in the low light. It wasn't sophisticated. But it didn't need to be. Claire moved to the next room and set another trap, this time using an oxygen canister rigged to a pressure release valve. She cracked the valve just enough to let gas seep into the room, then placed a broken light fixture near the doorway. 1 spark, 1 mistake. That's all it would take. She moved to the third room, a storage area filled with metal shelving units and stacked boxes. She pulled 3 of the shelving units away from the wall and repositioned them near the doorway, creating a narrow choke point. Then she climbed on top of the units and pulled a stack of boxes over the edge, leaving them balanced precariously. She didn't have grenades, she didn't have explosives, but she had physics. And she had knowledge of how people moved under stress. Claire took a position at the end of the hallway, crouched behind a concrete pillar, the AK raised and ready. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, and waited. The voices grew louder, closer. She heard boots on tile. Heard someone bark an order. Then she saw them. 4 insurgents moving in a loose stack formation, weapons up, checking doors as they went. The lead man pushed open the first door, the office with the tripwire. He stepped inside. The wire snapped. The wastebasket ignited. The fireball was small but sudden, filling the doorway with flame and thick black smoke. The man screamed and staggered backward, his hands over his face. The second man tried to pull him out. The third moved toward the next room. He kicked the door open. The oxygen ignited with a sharp whump. The blast threw him into the hallway, his uniform smoking, his rifle clattering to the floor. The fourth man panicked. He turned and ran toward the storage area, shouting into his radio. He didn't see the choke point. Didn't see the unstable shelving. He hit the metal frame at full speed. The shelving tipped. The boxes came down. 200 pounds of medical supplies and equipment buried him in seconds. Claire stepped out from behind the pillar. The hallway was chaos, smoke, fire, men on the ground. She raised the AK and fired 3 controlled bursts. The insurgents who were still moving stopped. She moved forward, checked them, and took their ammunition. 2 more magazines. She was up to 4 now. Better, but still not enough. The radio on her belt crackled. The voice on the other end was shouting, coordinates, orders. They were sending more. Claire turned and ran. She moved back toward the stairwell, descended to the basement level, and followed the service tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, the walls slick with condensation. Emergency lights were spaced every 20 feet, casting everything in sickly yellow. She reached the end and climbed the ladder. The hatch at the top opened into the equipment shed, a small concrete building filled with tools, spare parts, and fuel canisters. Amara and the others were there, huddled in the corner. They looked up when Claire emerged. Amara started. Delayed, Claire said. Not stopped. She moved to the small window and looked out. The vehicle depot was 50 meters away across open ground. 3 trucks were parked inside the chain-link enclosure. Coalition vehicles, armored. Fueled, but between the shed and the depot were 2 insurgents standing guard. Claire swore under her breath. She turned back to the group. Stay here, don't move, don't make noise. Garrett stood. We can help, no, Claire said firmly. You can't. She moved to the door and cracked it open. The night air was cold. The smoke from the hospital was visible in the distance, a dark column rising into the sky. She could hear sirens now, distant but coming closer. The coalition's quick reaction force. Finally, but they were still 10 minutes out. Maybe more. Claire pulled the AK tight against her shoulder and stepped outside. She moved low and fast, crossing the open ground in a wide arc, using the shadows and the terrain for cover. She came up behind the first guard, 20 feet away, his back to her. She didn't have a suppressor for the AK. If she fired, the second guard would hear. And so would everyone else. She needed to be quiet. Claire slung the rifle and pulled a folding knife from her boot. A small blade, 3 inches, serrated edge. She closed the distance in 4 silent steps. The guard never heard her coming. She took him down fast and clean, lowering his body to the ground without a sound. She wiped the blade on his uniform and moved toward the second guard. He was standing near the gate, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was looking toward the hospital, watching the fire. Claire approached from his left, staying in his blind spot. She was 3 feet away when his radio crackled. He reached for it. Claire moved. She drove the knife into the side of his neck, angled upward, severing the carotid. He tried to scream. She clamped her hand over his mouth and held him until he stopped moving. She let him drop and moved to the gate. It was locked. She pulled the keys from the second guard's belt and opened it. Then she ran back to the shed. Amara and the others were waiting. Claire waved them forward. Move now, straight to the trucks. Don't stop, they ran. Claire covered them, scanning the darkness, the AK raised. They reached the depot without incident. Claire pulled open the door of the nearest truck and gestured them inside. Drive north, she said. Stay on the access road. You'll hit the coalition checkpoint in 15 minutes. Tell them what happened. Tell them to send the QRF. Amara climbed into the driver's seat. She looked down at Claire. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Claire, go. Amara started the engine. The truck rumbled to life. She put it in gear and drove through the gate, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Claire watched them disappear down the road. Then she turned and looked back at the hospital. The fire was still burning. The smoke was thicker now, blacker. She could hear voices in the distance. Shouts. Engines. She pulled the radio from her belt and listened. The chatter had changed. They were retreating, pulling back. The QRF was close enough now that they could hear the helicopters. It was over, almost. Claire turned and started walking back toward the hospital. She still had ammunition. She still had a rifle. And there were still patients inside who couldn't move on their own. She wasn't leaving until she knew they were safe. She reached the rear entrance and stepped inside. The smoke was thick here, acrid, burning her lungs. She pulled her shirt over her mouth and moved through the corridors, checking rooms, calling out, looking for anyone who'd been left behind. She found 2, both unconscious. Both in beds near the fire zone. Claire grabbed the first one, a young man, maybe 20, with bandages covering half his face. She pulled him onto her back in a fireman's carry and moved toward the exit. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed. But she kept moving. She got him outside and laid him on the ground. Then she went back for the second. By the time she dragged the last patient out, the helicopters were overhead. Spotlights swept the ground. Voices crackled over loudspeakers. Claire stepped back into the shadows and watched. The quick reaction force landed in the courtyard, 30 soldiers, full kit, moving in tight formation. Medics rushed toward the patients Claire had pulled out. Officers shouted orders. The fire team moved toward the hospital with extinguishers and hoses. No one looked at Claire. No one saw her standing in the darkness, covered in smoke and blood. Holding a rifle that wasn't in any inventory, she turned and walked away. The sun rose at 6:04 hours. Claire sat on the tailgate of an abandoned supply truck 200 meters from the hospital. Perimeter, watching the scene unfold in the pale morning light. The fire was out. The smoke had thinned to a gray haze that hung low over the compound. The quick reaction force had secured the area and was moving through the building in teams, clearing rooms, tagging bodies. Documenting evidence, she'd stripped the rifle down and buried the parts in 3 separate locations. The AK went into a drainage culvert. The magazines went into a burn pit behind the motor pool. The radio went into a trash compactor. By the time anyone thought to look for them, they'd be gone. She'd washed her hands and face in a maintenance sink, changed into a clean pair of scrubs she kept in her locker, and walked out through the rear gate while the perimeter guards were distracted by the arriving helicopters. Now she was just another nurse. Exhausted, shaken, trying to process what had happened, that was the story. That's what anyone who looked at her would see. Claire watched as a medevac helicopter lifted off from the courtyard, carrying the worst of the wounded to a trauma center in Turkey. She watched as body bags were lined up near the east entrance, 8 of them zipped and tagged. She watched as the base commander arrived in an armored vehicle, flanked by officers and aides, his face tight with anger and disbelief. No one was looking for her. No one was asking questions, not yet. At 6:45, a coalition medic approached the truck. He was young, maybe 25, his uniform streaked with soot. "You okay?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Yeah. Just needed air. You work here, night shift, contract nurse." He glanced back at the hospital. "Hell of a night, yeah." He offered her a bottle of water. She took it, drank half, and handed it back. "They're setting up a staging area in the admin building," he said, "for staff debriefs. You should check in." "I will." He nodded and walked away. Claire sat for another 10 minutes. Then she stood, brushed the dust off her scrubs, and walked toward the admin building. The staging area was chaos. Nurses, doctors, orderlies, all of them talking at once, some crying, some sitting in stunned silence. Coalition officers were moving through the crowd with tablets, taking names, asking questions. Claire found a chair in the corner and sat down. She kept her head low, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't volunteer information. She waited. At 7:20, Dr. Amara Akafer walked into the room. She looked exhausted. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair was coming loose from its tie, and her eyes were red-rimmed. But she was alive. And she was looking for someone. Her eyes scanned the room. Then they stopped, on Claire. Amara walked over slowly and sat down in the chair next to her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amara said quietly, "You saved our lives." Claire didn't respond. "I don't know how you did it," Amara continued. "I don't know where you learned to do what you did, but I know that without you, we'd all be dead." Claire looked down at her hands. "I was just doing my job." "No," Amara's voice was firm. "You weren't." Claire met her eyes. Amara leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 15 years. I've worked in war zones. I've seen combat medics, special forces, security contractors. I know what training looks like. I know what experience looks like." She paused. "You moved through that hospital like you'd done it 100 times before. You knew where to go, you knew how to fight. You set traps. You killed 8 armed men with precision and control. That's not nursing, Claire. That's something else." Claire held her gaze but said nothing. Amara's expression softened. "I'm not going to ask you who you are. I'm not going to ask what you did before this. But I need to know one thing." "What? Are you here to help people, or are you here for something else?" Claire looked away, out the window toward the hospital. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the compound. She could see soldiers moving through the rubble. She could see the body bags being loaded onto a truck. She thought about the rifle hidden in pieces across the base. She thought about the call sign she hadn't used in 4 years. She thought about the life she'd left behind when she walked away from a uniform and a mission that had cost her everything. "Here to help people," Claire said quietly. That's all. Amara studied her for a long moment, then she nodded. Okay. She stood to leave, then paused. Your contract was up yesterday. I know. Are you staying? Claire shook her head. No, Amara looked like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. She just placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, squeezed once, and walked away. At 900, the base commander called a briefing in the operations center. Claire didn't attend. She wasn't required to. She was contract staff, not military. But she knew what they were saying. She could hear it in the fragments of conversation drifting through the hallways, 8 insurgents dead. No coalition casualties except the initial security team. The hospital was damaged but intact. The patients were safe. It was being called a miracle. No one could explain how a small group of unarmed medical staff had survived an organized assault by a trained enemy force. No one could explain how the insurgents had been neutralized so quickly and efficiently. The official report would say that the quick reaction force had arrived in time. That the insurgents had been disorganized, that luck and timing had saved lives, Claire knew better. But she also knew that no one would ask, no one wanted to know. Because asking meant uncovering things that were supposed to stay buried. At 10:30, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vance, the base commander, walked into the admin building. She was a tall woman in her late 40s, her uniform crisp despite the chaos, her eyes sharp and assessing. She scanned the room, then walked directly to Claire. Nurse Dawson. Claire stood. Ma'am, I'd like a word in private. Claire followed her into a small office at the back of the building. Vance closed the door and gestured to a chair. Claire sat. Vance remained standing. He'd been reviewing the incident reports, Vance said. Your name came up several times. Claire said nothing. Doctor, Akaffer said you got her and 3 others to safety. She said you moved through the hospital during the attack and helped evacuate patients. I did what I could, ma'am. Vance tilted her head. She also said you seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do, almost like you'd planned for it. Claire met her eyes. I worked night shift for 6 weeks, ma'am. I knew the layout. Did you know the insurgents' entry point? I guessed. Did you know how to set traps and ambushes? I used what was available. Vance crossed her arms. I pulled your file, Nurse Dawson. Contract employee hired through a Geneva-based medical staffing agency. Clean background check. Valid credentials. Excellent references. She paused. But when I tried to verify your previous employment history, I hit a wall. The staffing agency confirmed your hire, but they couldn't provide details on where you'd worked before. The references I called all checked out, but none of them could tell me anything specific about you. And when I ran your name through DoD databases, I got nothing. Claire didn't flinch. I'm a contract nurse, ma'am. I move around a lot. I don't leave much of a trail. Or someone scrubbed it. Silence. Vance leaned forward, her hands on the desk. I don't know who you are, Nurse Dawson. I don't know what you did before you came here. But I know that 8 trained insurgents are dead, and my staff is alive. And the only person who seems to have been in the right place at the right time, every single time, is you. Claire held her gaze. Vance straightened. I could push this, I could demand answers, I could hold you here until I get them. But you won't. No, Vance said quietly. I won't. She walked to the window and looked out at the compound. Because whoever you are, whatever you did, you saved lives last night. And I'm not in the business of punishing people who do the right thing. She turned back to Claire. Your contract ended yesterday. You're free to go. There's a transport leaving for the airfield in 30 minutes. I suggest you're on it. Claire stood. Thank you, ma'am. Vance nodded. Then she said, one more thing. Claire paused. If I ever find out you were here for any reason other than helping people, if I find out you were running an operation, gathering intelligence, or doing anything that put my staff at risk, I will find you. And I will make sure you answer for it. Claire met her eyes. Understood, ma'am. Vance held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she stepped aside and opened the door. Claire walked out. At 1100, Claire stood in the small room she'd been assigned when she arrived 6 weeks ago. It was bare metal bed frame, a locker, a single chair. She'd brought nothing with her except a duffel bag and a backpack. She'd leave with the same. She packed quickly. Scrubs, a few personal items, a toothbrush. No photos, no souvenirs, nothing that couldn't be replaced. She zipped the bag closed and slung it over her shoulder. Then she walked out without looking back. The transport was a 6-wheeled armored truck, idling near the main gate. A handful of other contractors were already inside. Aid workers, logisticians, a pair of journalists. No one spoke. Everyone looked exhausted. Claire climbed in and took a seat near the back. She set her bag at her feet and stared out the small window. The truck rolled through the gate and onto the dirt road that led north toward the airfield. Claire watched the hospital compound shrink in the distance. The smoke was almost gone now. The helicopters had left. The base looked almost normal. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes. At 13:30, the transport arrived at the Coalition airfield. Claire disembarked, showed her ID to the security checkpoint, and walked across the tarmac to a waiting cargo plane. It was headed to Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. From there, she'd catch a commercial flight to somewhere else. She hadn't decided where yet. She climbed the ramp and found a seat in the cargo bay. A few other passengers were scattered throughout, mostly contractors and off-duty soldiers. No one paid attention to her. The ramp closed. The engines spooled up. The plane taxied and lifted off. Claire looked out the small porthole window as the desert fell away beneath her. The base, the hospital, the road. All of it disappearing into the haze. She pulled a small phone from her pocket, not the one she'd been issued by the staffing agency, but a second device, plain and unregistered. She turned it on. There was one message waiting: contract fulfilled, payment transferred. New assignment available if interested. Claire stared at the message for a long time. Then she deleted it, powered off the phone, and pulled the SIM card out. She bent it in half and dropped it into the empty coffee cup on the floor. She didn't want a new assignment. She didn't want payment. She didn't want to be found. She just wanted to disappear. Again, 3 days later, Dr. Amara Akafer sat in the Temporary Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, reviewing patient files on a battered laptop. The hospital was partially operational again. The East Wing was still closed, but the main wards had been cleared and cleaned. Life was slowly returning to normal. On her desk was a stack of paperwork, incident reports, witness statements, personnel files. She'd been asked to provide a detailed account of what had happened the night of the attack. She'd written 3 pages. Most of it was accurate. But there was one section she'd left deliberately vague, the section about Claire Dawson. Amara had described her as calm, competent, and helpful. She'd mentioned that Claire had guided her and others to safety. She'd mentioned that Claire had assisted with patient evacuations. She didn't mention the rifle. She didn't mention the traps. She didn't mention the bodies. Because some things Amara had decided were better left unsaid, she closed the laptop and stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the compound. The sun was setting, casting the desert in shades of orange and gold, somewhere out there. Claire Dawson was gone, and Amara knew she'd never see her again. But she also knew that 37 people were alive because of her. That was enough, 4,000 miles away. In a small apartment in Prague with no name on the lease, Claire Dawson sat at a kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her phone buzzed. A text, no name, just a number she didn't recognize. Thank you. Claire stared at the message. She didn't know who'd sent it. Amara, maybe, or Vance. Or someone else entirely. It didn't matter. She deleted the message. She powered off the phone. She stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out below her, gray, wet, anonymous. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives. Going to work, coming home, being seen. She'd never have that. She'd saved lives. She'd kept a promise she'd made to herself 4 years ago when she walked away from the uniform and the missions and the life that had tried to destroy her. She would help people. Quietly. Invisibly. Without recognition or thanks, that was enough. Claire finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She packed a single bag. By morning, the apartment was empty. By evening, she was gone.